In ancient India, using elephants to execute criminals wasn't just about punishment, it was a very dramatic display of the king's sheer power and the state's unchallengeable authority. These majestic beasts were trained to crush, dismember, or even torment offenders in front of an assembled crowd. Imagine an elephant, guided by its mahout, methodically stepping on or tearing apart the condemned. A horrifying sight. This method was not only effective in dispensing justice, but also served as a chilling deterrent to would-be criminals. The symbolism was potent. Just as an elephant could control and dominate with its size and strength, so too could the king govern his subjects. Historical records, like those from the Mughal era, detail how these executions were a public spectacle, emphasizing the gravity of the crime and the consequences of defying royal laws. In ancient India, the punishment of mutilation was not just about retribution, it was a lifelong billboard advertising one's crimes. Take, for instance, the fate of thieves. Caught with your hand in the proverbial cookie jar? Well, you might literally lose that hand. The logic was brutally simple. No hand, no more stealing. Adultery too had its unique markers. Noses were often the price of illicit love. This wasn't just a physical penalty, but a social one, visibly branding the adulterer and affecting their interactions in society. The idea was as much about prevention as it was punishment, serving as a warning to others about the costs of criminal behavior. Such punishments were designed to be as much as a deterrent to the community as they were retribution against the individual, ensuring that every glance in the mirror or sideways look from a neighbor reminded the wrongdoer and others of the steep price of transgression. Impalement in ancient India was as grim as it sounds, a truly chilling method of execution that we've seen come up a lot in history. A long, sharp stake is driven through the body of the condemned, usually from the bottom to the top. The exact trajectory could vary. Sometimes it was a slow and agonizing journey through vital organs, and other times, if placed just right, it was a mercifully quick exit. This wasn't just about punishing the criminal like a lot of these on this list, it was a public spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience among the populace. Historical records aren't flush with named examples from India, but like I mentioned, similar practices were noted around the ancient world, highlighting the widespread use of this absolutely brutal punishment. In ancient India, the choice of such a method emphasized the absolute power of rulers and the severe consequences of defying the law, serving as a warning that the stakes, quite literally, were high when it came to crime and punishment. Sorry, I couldn't help myself with that one. In ancient India, the concept of a fair trial took a rather fiery, watery, or gravity-defying turn with the use of ordeals meant to determine guilt or innocence. Think of it as the ultimate test of fate, where only the divine could decide your destiny. If you were accused of a crime, you might have to prove your innocence by literally playing with fire or taking a plunge in a water trial. For instance, the ordeal by fire could involve walking through flames or carrying a hot iron. If you emerged unscathed, you were deemed innocent, as it was believed that the gods had intervened to protect the truthful. Similarly, the water ordeal might see an accused thrown into a river. Floating meant innocence, while sinking, somewhat counterintuitively, suggested guilt. Another head-scratcher was the ordeal by balance, where you'd be weighed before and after the accusation. If you weighed less afterwards, the loss was seen as the weight of your guilt lifting. These methods were steeped in the belief that supernatural forces would not allow the innocent to suffer, a theory that definitely puts one's fate squarely in the hands of the gods. Wow. If supernatural forces didn't allow innocent people to suffer, the world would be very different. I'm just having a deep thought in the middle of filming this video. Okay, oh my god, I'm losing my mind. Speaking of losing my mind, the next one. Next up on our list today, we are talking about sanguis et arena, or blood and sand. This sounds like it was made up just for Gladiator or 300, but in ancient Rome, this was a real life, or rather real death, for many unfortunate souls. The concept was chillingly straightforward. Gladiators, who were typically slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, were thrown into an arena to fight until one of them died. This brutal spectacle wasn't technically a legal legal punishment, but made for wildly popular entertainment, drawing huge crowds who came to watch the violent clashes. For the gladiators, it was often an unintended death sentence. They'd battle it out armed with nothing but their wits and weapons on a sandy floor designed to soak up the blood. The crowd would go wild as these fighters, who trained intensely for these moments, faced off in a grim dance of death, all for the roaring approval of the spectators. It shows us quite the harsh reality of entertainment in ancient times, where human life could be just another part of the show. Also, I'm kind of just realizing now that that just is probably the most popular thing that we think of. The first thing you think of when you think of ancient Rome is the gladiator battles. So just because we don't do it anymore, I feel like we're still kind of morbidly obsessed with that. I don't know. That was just a real thought I just had that I guess I decided to just say out loud. Sometimes you just gotta say your own thoughts out loud, I guess. I don't know. Next up, we are talking about uxoricide by molten gold. Okay, this is one of the most hair-raising punishments in ancient Rome. A corrupt official or a traitor gets caught, and as a twisted form of poetic justice, they end up with molten gold being poured down their throat. It's gruesome, right? But for the Romans, this was a simple-packed way to highlight the condemned's greed, literally filling them with the wealth they so nefariously sought during their lifetime. While it sounds like something so deranged that it has to be fake, this real, rare, and extreme punishment was reserved for those whose betrayal or corruption was deemed extraordinarily severe. It was both a literal and a metaphorical representation of their sins consuming them. So next time you think about Roman punishments, remember that for them, justice was not only about retribution, but also about making a statement. Next up, we are heading over to the Tarpeian Rock. This was a notorious spot in ancient Rome that was literally the downfall of many. Perched on the southern summit of Capitoline Hill, this steep cliff was Rome's go-to spot for dealing with traitors. When someone was convicted of betrayal, they were taken to the top of this cliff and thrown off. That's really all it was. You'd think a fall like that would be a quick ticket out, but not so much. The cliff wasn't always high enough to kill someone instantly, which meant the unlucky ones faced a slow, excruciating demise as they lay broken at the base. It was a very brutal display meant to scare anyone else who thought betraying Rome might be a good idea. I'm afraid of jail now, so I would never do a crime right now because I don't want to go to jail. I don't know how people did crimes in ancient Rome. You could be thrown off a cliff? Oh my god, that's crazy. Imagine knowing that and still committing the act of betrayal. No, I'd be the most trustworthy person around. Next on our list, we are talking about breaking on the wheel, which might sound like some ancient form of extreme sports, but trust me, it's not that at all. This brutal form of punishment, though more popular in medieval times if it sounds familiar, but it actually got its start back in ancient Rome. Basically, the condemned person is tied to a gigantic wheel, kind of like a nightmarish version of a Ferris wheel. Then, using heavy clubs, executioners would give a whole new meaning to breaking a leg as they systematically shattered the victim's bones. This process was excruciatingly painful and very drawn out, leading to a death that was anything but quick. While it's a grisly spectacle to imagine, breaking on the wheel shows us a very clear example of the extreme lengths human societies have gone to in the name of justice or just a plain old public spectacle. Speaking of public spectacle, to finish off our list today, we are talking about public humiliation and death. In ancient Rome, public humiliation wasn't just a brutal punishment, it was also an entertainment event. Imagine being stripped down to nearly nothing, your mistakes on full display as you're marched through the streets. The Romans turned this into an art form where offenders, often guilty of lesser crimes, faced not just the scorn of a few, but the mockery of a crowd. This wasn't just a march of shame, it was a parade with a lethal finale. After being jeered and taunted by the masses, the final act would typically be execution, often carried out in a gruesomely creative way that kept the crowd entertain. In the shadows of history, a dark truth lurks. Ancient China, a land of beauty and wisdom, also harbored a chilling secret. Punishments so brutal, so unimaginable, they were definitely not for the faint of heart. Brace yourselves as we delve into the forbidden depths of ancient justice. What you're about to see may disturb you. We are starting off this list today talking about Ling Chi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This was an ancient Chinese execution method that was as gruesome as it sounds. Imagine being tied up to a post and then having small pieces of your flesh sliced off, one excruciating cut at a time. This wasn't a quick process either. It was designed to be a slow, agonizing ordeal that could last for hours, with the executioner methodically removing flesh to prolong the torment. Used for the worst of the worst crimes like treason, this punishment was meant to be a deterrent, a very visible yet horrifying show of what happens when you seriously betray the empire. Banned in the early 20th century, this brutal practice is just a reminder of how far punishment has evolved from the days when making a spectacle of suffering was the norm. Next, we are talking about nose removal. Cutting off someone's nose might sound like a bit of a bizarre punishment today, but back in ancient China, this was serious business. Known as yi, this penalty was one of the big five in the old school Chinese justice system, along with other cheerful options like tattooing and chopping off feet. More on that later. Picture you're living in the Western Zoo period around the 11th to the 8th century BCE, and yi is all the rage for punishing the bad guys, especially the ones who couldn't break into a city during a siege. This nose-chopping business wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it sat smack in the middle of the punishment scale, tougher than getting some ink on your face as a permanent mark of shame, but not quite as harsh as losing a foot. It first pops up in the Zuli, a classic text on rituals, but it's even scribbled on ancient bones. As time rolled on, especially during the chaotic spring and autumn period from the 8th to the 5th century BCE, people started to cool off on the whole nose-cutting thing, but it of course made a comeback during the Warring States period and the Qin dynasty from the 5th century to 206 BCE. Back then, if you were a soldier or an official who messed up big time, like failing to capture a city, you might find yourself a bit lighter in the nose department. Sometimes they'd really go to town and combine this with other punishments like the tattooing just to add insult to injury. But then Emperor Wen of the Han dynasty came along around 180 to 157 BCE, and he was like, hey, maybe we should just chill out a little bit on the mutilations. He swapped out the nose cutting for a whopping 300 hits with a light stick, which honestly doesn't sound much better, but it's definitely a start. Despite the official ban, this gruesome tradition stuck around in practice here and there, sneaking into the southern and northern dynasties around 300 to 600 CE, and even into the time of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, up to the 13th century. Next, we are talking about boiling to death. Okay, it might sound like a gruesome method cooked up from a horror movie, but it was a very real and terrifying punishment in ancient China, particularly for heinous crimes like killing your own parents. A huge cauldron would be filled with boiling water or oil, and the condemned person would be slowly lowered into it. It's definitely as nightmarish as it sounds, like a scene straight out of a medieval tale, designed to inflict maximum pain and draw out the suffering. This wasn't just about punishing a crime, it was about sending a chilling message to anyone who might dare to commit such a taboo. The authorities used this method to show the power and reach of the law in a way that was as visually shocking and morally horrifying. So next time you're impatiently watching a pot of water boil, spare a thought for the poor souls of ancient times, for whom that bubbling cauldron represented a much darker fate. Next, we are talking about being crushed by elephant. This over-the-top execution method wasn't originally a Chinese invention. It was actually borrowed from nearby cultures and countries like India and Southeast Asia, where elephants were abundant and had a long history of being part of royal courts and armies. Elephants were symbols of royal power and majesty, so using them as tools of execution added a layer of terrifying spectacle to this punishment. Here's how this horrific spectacle would typically unfold. It would start off with the condemned's last walk. The offender, often a prisoner of war or someone guilty of a severe crime like killing or treason, would be led out into a large open space. This space was usually a public area because yes, this was a public execution meant to scare anyone else who might think of breaking the law. Then enter the elephant. A trained execution elephant, which could be as big as 10 feet tall at the shoulder, would be brought in. These weren't your friendly circus elephants, they were trained to kill. The elephant trainer would direct the elephant, often from a seat right on its back. And then finally, the crushing would take place. On a given signal, the elephant would raise its massive foot and then bring it down onto the condemned. Sometimes, to prolong the agony, the elephant would slowly roll its foot back and forth over the body. Other times, the execution was quick, with the elephant delivering a single, bone-crushing blow. The use of an elephant was not just about the physical destruction that it could cause, it was also a deeply psychological method of instilling fear. The very sight of such a giant beast being used as an instrument of death was enough to make anyone think twice about crossing the line. Elephants are extremely intelligent and can be trained, making them more predictable and manageable in crowded execution scenarios.
Something very important in particularly gladiator fights was making sure fluid was shed. Typically the red fluid that tends to run through folks' veins, and there's a lot of uses for fluid. Now, the earliest instance of red shed being associated with public gladiator fights was likely borrowed from the ancient Etruscans. They considered the shedding of scarlet elixir as an essential part of important funeral processions. So you would honor the deceased and the gods by shedding the fluids of enemy captives. See? Punishment part. A rather horrifying looking divinity with a hammer would then wait for them in the other worlds. So, get the fluid out, bop them on the head, have fun. So if you thought being drawn and quartered was a brutal way to go, would you prefer to be burned alive? Because honestly, I think most folks would rather just get it over with. Now, also losing your head could be an option, but that's also not really fun, and it might have taken a long while. Nevertheless, those sentenced by cremation or ad flammis did not have a pleasant time. So if you're a convict and you're sentenced to be burned alive, you're going to be forced to wear some beautifully decorated clothes soaked with flammable substances, and then you're going to dance around while you're being lit on fire. And the resulting dances weren't pleasant for the convicts. Once again, this was just adding on to the idea of human turmoil for the entertainment of nobles. They had to do something for fun, it was a silly little treat if you will. So if you chose off with your head as the best way to go, this next part is for you. Unless you're Marie Antoinette, whoopsies, my bad. Sentences ad gladium could result in beheadings, but also in one-sided fights with a foregone conclusion. So two sentenced people were pushed into the arena together, because you gotta get that public entertainment. One would carry a sword, the other person would be unarmed. The latter had to run all around the arena while the one holding the weapon had to catch and off them. When this occurred, the winner remained in the arena, handed the sword to a new prisoner, and then you get the game all over again. The last one standing was normally finished off by a hunter. There's no winning in this situation. I know this is a redundant statement by this point, but it's cruel to give folks hope that they'll survive, make them fight for their lives, and not have it be worth it in the end. Which is a haunting sentence no matter what the context. Emperor Nero took delight in having people buried alive. He almost exclusively saved this punishment for Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity. If you didn't know who they are, in ancient Rome, these were Vestals. They were priestesses of Vesta, the virgin goddess of Rome's sacred hearth and its flame. And the Vestals were unlike any other public priesthood. They were chosen before puberty from a number of suitable candidates, freed from any legal ties and obligations to their birth family, and enrolled in Vesta's priestly college of 6 priestesses. They were supervised by a senior Vestal, but chosen and governed by Rome's leading male priest, the Pontifex Maximus. In the imperial era, this meant the emperor. Vesta's acolytes vowed to serve her for at least 30 years, to study and practice her rites in service of the Roman state, and to maintain their chastity throughout. As well as their obligations on behalf of Rome, Vestals had extraordinary rights and privileges, some of which were granted to no others. Doesn't matter the gender. The Vestals took turns to supervise Vesta's sacred hearth, so at least one Vestal was stationed there all the time. Vestals who allowed the sacred fire to go out? Oof, punished with all sorts of ways. If you lost your chastity, then you're sentenced to a living burial, and it must seem voluntary. And if people knew who you had coitus with, those folks are going to be really badly hurt to death. Granted, these were very rare events. Most Vestals retired with a generous pension and universal respect, and then they were free to marry, but not a lot of them did. Some folks even renewed their vows. So, Where's the punishment elements? Well, in one account, Nero forced himself on the priestess Rubria. For her punishment, she was entombed inside a small cave and left to die. Another form of torment supported by Nero involved the accused digging his own grave. After it was dug, a stake was set inside the grave. The accused was then bound and pushed into the grave. So if he had like a minor crime, he would be pushed so that the stake pierced through his heart. Anybody convicted of a heinous crime was pushed so that the stake would mortally wound them. And then you'd leave them to die, because why not? Or hey, you could bury them alive. 50-50. And finally for today, the last thing that was kind of icky back then was crucifixion. It was pretty common, and it was a punishment much more ancient than the Romans. Granted, it was also the way Jesus died, which we're going to refer to it as that from here on out. It was a method of capital punishment where the condemned was tied or nailed to a large wooden cross, beam, or stake and then left to hang there until eventual death. It was used as a punishment by the Persians, the Romans, and a lot of other folks. It has been used in some countries as recently as the earliest 20th century, by the way. But if we're talking specifically about the Roman Empire, well, the gibbet, so that was what you would be hanging out on, it took a lot of different shapes. Like at some points, it was just one vertical stake, called in Latin crux simplex, and this was the simplest available construction for tormenting and killing the condemned. Frequently, however, there was a cross-shaped piece attached at either the top to give the shape of a T, or just below the top, as the form that is most familiar in Christian symbolism. The most ancient image of a Roman crucifixion actually depicts an individual on a T-shaped cross. This method of killing could result in an agonizing and terrible death. Because the agony might last for several hours and, people wanted things to go faster, sometimes you'd break the legs of convicts and then you'd release some leopards, tigers, or lions to maul them, just to get it over with so you can move on to the next fun thing to watch.
Being fed to crocodiles and smacked around with whips are some of the worst ways to go. So it's pretty easy to see why it was much easier to just abide by the law in ancient Egypt instead of receiving these 10 punishments. First on our list, being buried alive. This was a punishment that was certainly active in many ancient societies. It was actually used quite frequently in ancient Egypt as a form of capital punishment. While it is not known which criminals would receive this brutal form of punishment, we can only assume that it was used for very serious crimes. The Egyptians actually had tombs created that were dedicated to live burials for criminals, so it appears that this method was used more frequently than many people might think. Archaeologists have uncovered many Egyptian tombs over the years, but it turns out that some of them might have been the result of burial punishments. This was also a cost-effective way to deal with criminals that the government simply didn't want to deal with anymore. It was obviously very inhumane, but the Egyptian pharaohs saw this as a very effective method. Knowing that you could be buried alive for your bad decisions would definitely be an effective way to keep criminals from committing any more serious crimes. Next on our list is impalement. This one is exactly what it sounds like, and it is incredibly gruesome. This form of punishment was used for various types of major crimes such as adultery and grave robbing. It was definitely haunting the nightmares of many criminals in ancient Egypt. This type of punishment actually came in many different forms, as it could be used as capital punishment or very painful torture. The authorities would tie the convicted criminal to a post where they would then be impaled by a large spear. While the torturer would sometimes deliver a direct blow to the heart or brain for capital punishment, other times they would just take out a leg or an arm for torture purposes. This form of punishment would also sometimes be used on suspects who the authorities were pressing for answers during an investigation. Whether it was a death penalty or torture, the threat of impalement was just another way the authorities in ancient Egypt kept potential criminals in line. Up next we have hand amputations. Well, now that we've seen that ancient Egyptians were not afraid to use large spears for punishment, shouldn't be too surprising that they were willing to take things one step further. This gruesome form of punishment was originally invented for grave robbers who had been caught in the act. Now, grave robbing was a serious problem in ancient Egypt, as many people were interested in finding buried treasure that people had brought with them to the afterlife. Pharaohs realized that this was a huge problem, so they came up with a very scary tactic to deal with anyone who was caught in the act. Authorities were sometimes instructed to chop off the hands of any grave robber who was caught in the middle of their crime. They saw this as the most effective way to deter anyone from robbing a grave, as no one would ever want to live the rest of their lives without the use of their hands. After that, we have the beating of 100 blows. This was perhaps the longest and most grueling form of non-capital punishment that could be issued in ancient Egypt. This was another punishment that was initially created for grave robbers, but was eventually used to punish a wide range of petty thefts. First-time grave robbers wouldn't always be subjected to an amputation, but there was another rough form of torture that was awaiting them instead. Authorities would gather in a group and deliver a grand total of 100 blows to the convicted criminal 4 for their actions. It is not known how they settled on 100 as the magic number, but the guards would strike the criminal with whips while they were forced to endure the brutal pain. One heavy hit from a whip can leave anyone with a very nasty wound, so we can't even imagine how 100 of them must feel. Criminals would not be able to move after such a heavy beating, so this would obviously keep them away from any grave sites in the near future. Next up, we have donkey torture. It turns out that donkeys played a major role in ancient Egypt's justice system. Now, just to be clear, this is nothing like pin the tail on the donkey, and nobody has any fun in this twisted scenario. This was another form of punishment that looked to punish grave robbers, but there was a very specific type of grave robber who had to face the donkey. The animals would be brought in to punish anyone who even attempted to rob the grave of a fallen pharaoh. While other robbers would be beaten or have their hands removed, these criminals who defaced the resting place of a pharaoh would be taken advantage of by a donkey. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like, and it is absolutely disgusting. But even despite this terrible punishment potentially awaiting them, some people still decided to take the risk to try and rob the fallen pharaoh of their riches. Next on our list is burning. Up next, buried alive. Yep, just in case the authorities didn't want to get creative, they could literally just dump somebody in the dirt. Although criminals like the mafia might still be using this today, it was actually quite common for the government to use this as a form of punishment hundreds of years ago. Of course, this was pretty much reserved for some of the worst criminals in the land, but that doesn't make it any less unsettling. Some civilizations like ancient Egypt even had designated tombs that were made specifically for burial punishments. Archaeologists have uncovered so many ancient tombs in Egypt, so it's likely they would have discovered many victims of this terrible punishment. The authorities also liked the fact that this method was cost effective and didn't require any sort of fancy tools. It was honestly just another way to scare people into making sure they never broke the law. Next up is the ducking stool. To people nowadays, this probably looks like a normal chair that's strapped to a piece of wood. But if anyone saw this hundreds of years ago, they knew it was a sign that their time was up. The ducking stool is literally just a wooden chair that is strapped onto a plank. It was actually one of the worst punishment tools ever created. Once again, this was reserved for some of the worst criminals around who the authorities did not want to deal with anymore. The criminal would be strapped into the chair and tossed into a river, but they would have no way of escaping. It was just an agonizing way for the chair to slowly sink into the water as the person lost their ability to breathe. This was torture right up until the end, and was easily one of the worst ways to go. The only thing that someone could really hope for was that a deadly predator would finish them off quicker just to get it over with. After that, we have falling. This was quite possibly the simplest form of capital punishment that's ever existed, but it might actually be the worst. In special cases where the authorities wanted to get rid of someone and didn't want to waste any resources on them, they would literally just push them off of a cliff. A person would be forced to fall to their ultimate demise, and their final thoughts would be knowing that no one wanted to spend a dime on them. It was also a clear indication that absolutely nobody liked them, so the feeling of humiliation would stick with the person right before they hit the ground. In some cases, authorities wouldn't even head to the bottom to clean up the mess. They would usually just let wild animals come along and handle that job for them. So not only was it humiliating and demoralizing for a person in their final moments, it even lasted well after they were gone. This was definitely one of the worst ways to go. Next on our list is marooning. So it turns out that pirates had some of the worst punishments of all time. And that shouldn't really come as any surprise given the fact that they are professional criminals, but some of them are much worse than others. Marooning might not seem as gruesome as other punishments at first glance, but is by far one of the worst. If any pirate managed to break the code and commit an inexcusable crime against the rest of their crew, they would be sentenced to a terrible fate of isolation. Marooning essentially meant leaving a person on a deserted island with absolutely no way of escaping. The crew would find somewhere that was far enough away from the mainland the pirate couldn't swim to safety, and leave them with nothing but a bottle of their favorite drink and a firearm. This basically left the disgruntled pirate with a few choices. They could either drink themselves into the grave, pass out from starvation and dehydration, or just use the firearm to get it over with quickly. Of course, this also meant the rest of the crew wanted absolutely nothing to do with you anymore and just wanted you gone for good. And finally, we have the Judas Cradle. This is another tool like the head crusher that could be used as a torture device or a way to put an end to some of the worst criminals in the land. The Judas Cradle was a rather sharp pyramid object that only served one purpose. A person would be suspended in the air with ropes and held above this pointy object. Executioners would then lower them onto the tip of the object until it started to dig into their backside. Now, on some occasions, they would only lower them enough to hurt them badly and get them to confess to their crimes, but other cases called for a much worse fate. If someone was sentenced to capital punishment via the Judas cradle, they would be lowered onto the tip of the pyramid until it eventually went all the way through. There was no easy way to go when it came to medieval punishments, but this is one item that no prisoner ever wanted to see.
Number 10. Aphrodite and Lemnos. Kicking off this list, we have some pretty tame punishments. Definitely cruel to say the least, but more on the non-lethal side of things, as gods' sakes go. Apparently the gods love to be praised. Yeah, they're awesome. But sometimes they do some foul stuff. The goddess of beauty herself, Aphrodite, gets pretty pissed when she's not obsessed over. And the women of the Isle of Lemnos were kinda slacking on the prayer department. So she cursed the people of the island with a foul smell. I mean, that's pretty mean. Everybody stinks sometimes in life, you know. It's life. Little Musk never hurt anybody. But apparently the stink was so bad, all their partners left them and they were quite upset.
Bruh.
Which I can understand. It was probably just the equivalent to like the Great Stink in Europe, you know? Bodies and carcasses on a hot grease day just heating up the water and stinking it up. But nope, now it's a curse. Poor women of Lemnos probably get that rep for a while, you know? Stereotypes, they're brutal. I don't like them. Also, little salt water under the armpits. Boom, easy fix. Number 9, Demeter and Asclepius. Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, and her hatred for a certain mortal man. A king, actually. Demeter apparently was out looking for her abducted daughter Persephone and was thirsty from running around, naturally. She found a cottage owned by a little old lady named Hecuba, asking to wet her whistle and started drinking some barley juice. Thirsty as all Poseidon, she was chugging from all the running around. The son of the woman, just a little kid, basically was like, "Thirsty much?" Yeah, you don't mock a god, no man. She threw her drink in his face and turned him immediately into a spotted newt.
You're done. You're done.
Okay, couple things here. Little excessive, I think. I mean, what do I know? I guess you shouldn't talk shit, kid, you know? Talk shit, get turned into a newt. That's the saying, isn't it? Number 8, Demeter and Erysichthon. Erysichthon of Thessaly ordered all of the trees of the sacred grove of Demeter to be cut down. Yeah, that's a big mistake right there. Industrial logging. One huge oak was covered with beautiful wreaths, a symbol of every prayer Demeter had ever granted, and so the men refused to cut it down. Every other one, of course, yeah, let's go get that rustic log cabin look. Erysichthon needed more wood, so he himself grabbed an axe and went out and cut down that last tree. He was cursed by a nymph, naturally, whose prayer had been heard by Demeter herself. Long story short, she was like, "You want to build and eat? No problem." Gave him the munchies of a lifetime. Non-stop hunger. And insatiable hunger. Guy ate everything in sight. He was so hungry, Guy started eating himself. Yeah, all of him. Look, I've been hungry and picked something off the floor, 5-second rule, no problem. But I've never garlic and buttered my own fingers. But greed is greed, firm but fair. Number 7, Sisyphus and Hades. Sisyphus was the first king of Ephyra. A cruel king. He killed guests and travelers in his palace, which was a violation of guest obligations, which fell under Zeus's domain, thus angering him. He took pleasure in these killings because they allowed him to maintain his iron fist rule. Zeus was really pissed, yeah. This guy was cocky, and he punished him for cheating death twice. But his younger brother, Hades, caught wind of this and was like, no. As a punishment for this trickery, Hades made Sisyphus roll a huge boulder endlessly up a steep hill, forever. Yeah, he was like, no, Zeus, I got this one. Brothers helping brothers. Hades then displayed his own cleverness by enchanting the boulder to rolling away from Sisyphus right before he reached the top, resulting in an eternity of getting jacked quads and hammies, and an eternity of uselessly, effortlessly, and unending frustration. Yeah, that's really annoying. Number 6. Hera and Io. Okay, so we're moving away from kind of firm but fair and non-lethals to a little bit more and more cruel. Io was a beautiful woman to whom Zeus fell in love with, a married man. Ugh. Io was the daughter of Inachus, one of the river gods and king of Argos. She was living in Argos when Hera learned about this secret relationship, and she was a little hurt. I mean, who wouldn't be? Stewing in her sinister revenge, Hera turned Io into a cow to keep her away from her husband. You know, pretty non-lethal. Very mean, but, you know, fair. After being cheated on again by the same woman, she was like, alright, I guess that didn't work, and Hera was like, I'm done. She then sent a giant gadfly to sting Io continuously in cow form until she ran away, mad cow style, wandering from country to country, always being stung. Okay, I get this. You want to stop hanging around my man? You get stung every time, okay? Yeah. Bye-bye.
Number 5. Trial by ordeal. Trial by ordeal of water was insane. It's honestly hilarious to think of. It was a medieval method of determining guilt or innocence. Now the accused would be thrown into a body of water, often a river or a pond, something dirty back then, and if they floated, well, it was believed that God was protecting them and that they were innocent. But if they sank, however, well, they were deemed guilty. They were naughty, right? This practice was based on the belief that water, being a pure element created by the Lord, would reject impurities such as sin. And it was also thought that drowning was an acceptable punishment for those who were deemed guilty. Because, yeah, sure. The trial by ordeal of water was widely used throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and continued until the early modern period. So yeah, it lasted a while. However, it was eventually abolished due to its high mortality rate and, well, lack of reliability in determining guilt or innocence. It was a bunch of bullshit. Who knew? Water rejects impurities. That would be jarring. You try and have a bath, you just get launched out. You're like, oh, okay then. Gotcha. Heard. Number 4, the lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler device dates back to medieval times, as all these great gadgets do, and it was used as a form of punishment for those who committed crimes such as heresy or treason. The device consisted of a hollow metal sphere with a long handle. It looks like something you'd get from Elden Ring. It's like a weird looking wand, I don't know. It was then filled with molten lead or boiling oil. You already know where I'm going with this one. The Punisher would then hold the sphere over the victim's naked body, always naked again, and then allow the hot liquid to drip through small holes onto your skin, causing severe burns and excruciating pain. Now, over time, variations of the lead sprinkler were developed, including ones with multiple spouts to, increase the amount of liquid being poured onto victim or victims. Yeah, they got creative. Just the thing you want to hear in this kind of list. They toyed around with some ideas, sure. Number 3, the guillotine. A classic, not quite ancient, but we gotta mention it. First seen in France during the late 18th century as an alternative to other forms of capital punishment, all those other horrible versions. Those were seen as cruel and inhumane, but this one, dare I say, changed the game. It quickly became the preferred method of execution in France and was used extensively throughout the French Revolution to execute thousands of people, including King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette. The guillotine's popularity spread throughout Europe, with several countries adopting it as their primary means of capital punishment. They're like, hey, that looks pretty cheap and horrible, let's do that. It continued to be used until the mid-20th century when most countries abolished capital punishment altogether. Now, despite its gruesome reputation, some argue that the guillotine was a humane method of execution because it was quick and painless compared to the other 9 that I've mentioned on this list. Oh my god. Number 2, the thumbscrew. This one, for some reason, this one hits me the most. Thumbscrews were a method of inflicting pain by crushing the fingers or the toes, or sometimes the knees. They would make massive thumbscrews. Knee screws, almost. The victim's digits were inserted into the screw and then it was slowly tightened, causing, of course, excruciating pain and potentially permanent damage. This form of punishment was commonly used during medieval times, of course, and as means of extracting information. Yeah, if you do that to me, I'll say anything in 4 minutes or less. It was also seen during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions from those suspected of heresy. Thumbscrews were often made of iron or brass and could be adjusted to increase or decrease pressure on your body. Anywhere. Like I said earlier, they would get creative with where they would put these screws of death. Not good. Despite its brutal nature, thumbscrew torture remained in use for centuries before eventually falling out of favor due to its, well, extreme cruelty. At what point do you decide, right? Like some guy's like, you know what? It's a little bit too much. Let's get this one. We're just gonna put him in the coffin for now. Thumbscrews are so old. And finally, number 1, cement shoes. We'll end on a 20th century mafia punishment because why not, all right? I wrote the thing. I can talk about what I want. Let's do it. You made it this far too. We'll end on a not horrible one. Cement shoes involved placing the victim's feet in, well, as you could guess, buckets filled with wet concrete, which then of course hardens around their feet. Science right there. That's how that works. Unless you have a moving truck thing, then that cement's gonna dry pretty fast. At that point, you're unable to move or escape, and the victim is then thrown into a body of water to sink down and drown. This brutal technique was popularized by organized crime groups and mafias and stuff like that back in the early 20th century as a way to dispose of informants or those who had betrayed the group. Betrayed the mafia. The first recorded use of cement shoes was in New York City in 1935 when 2 victims were found dead with their feet encased in concrete. Yeah, new fear unlocked. I never knew. There we go.
Ancient Greece, known for its philosophers, playwrights, and profound contributions to art and science, also has a darker side: its system of justice. The punishments in ancient Greece could be extraordinarily harsh and would certainly make modern sensibilities cringe. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. To start off today, we are talking about hemlock poisoning. Hemlock poisoning is one of those ancient Greek punishments that you might say has an infamous reputation, thanks in no small part to the philosopher Socrates. So picture Athens, 399 BC, a city bustling with political intrigue and intellectual debate. Socrates, the OG of stirring the pot with thought-provoking questions, is accused of corrupting the minds of Athenian youth and disrespecting the traditional gods. His sentence? Death by hemlock. Now, hemlock isn't your standard poison. When you drink this nefarious brew, it slowly paralyzes you, starting from your feet up until it reaches your lungs. But here's the kicker: while this is happening, you're fully conscious until your final breath. Socrates took this sentence in stride, using his last moments to philosophize about the nature of life and death, which only added to his legend. So next time you're sipping on something bitter, spare a thought for old Socrates, who turned a deadly drink into one of history's most dramatic exit speeches. Next, we are talking about ostracism. Imagine living in ancient Athens where your social life and status are everything, and then one day, bam, you're voted off the island, so to speak. That's ostracism for you. In this uniquely Athenian twist on punishment, no blood was shed, but the social consequences? Brutal. Once a year, the Athenians could vote to exile someone they thought was getting a bit too powerful or troublesome. It wasn't a small group of judges or a king deciding your fate, but potentially just every average Joe and Jane with a piece of pottery to scratch a name on. If you were the lucky winner of this ancient popularity contest in reverse, you had to pack your bags and leave Athens for 10 long years. You could keep your property, and if things went well, you could come back after your time was up. No hard feelings, officially anyway. But imagine the hit to your social standing. One day you're a well-known figure in the bustling agora, and the next you're a persona non grata, hoping your friends will remember you a decade later. Ostracism wasn't just about keeping ambitious folks in check, it was a dramatic reminder that in Athens, being part of the community was everything, and losing that was one of the harshest penalties imaginable. Next, we are talking about talionic punishment. This punishment, or the law of retaliation, encapsulates the idea of an eye for an eye. It's a bit like the world's oldest version of payback. In ancient Greece, this wasn't just a metaphorical suggestion, it was taken quite literally. If you were caught in the act of, say, gouging someone's eye out, the legal system would ensure that the same gruesome fate befell you. This kind of justice was all about balance and symmetry. The punishment had to directly match the crime in severity and nature. It's a very straightforward, albeit kind of harsh way to keep people in line. This tit-for-tat approach meant that potential criminals knew exactly the kind of pain and loss they would suffer if they committed a crime. While it might sound excessively brutal, the system was rooted in the idea of deterring wrongdoing by the threat of receiving the same treatment you dished out. So, if you weren't keen on losing an eye, the solution was simple: don't take someone else's. I don't know, that doesn't really sound that crazy to me. I don't know if that says a lot about me or not, but it's kind of like, okay, well, don't do it. It's like the golden rule: treat other people how you want to be treated, but like a dark version of that. Okay, anyways, next up we are talking about keel hauling. Keel hauling might sound like a word from a pirate adventure, but it's actually a really grisly maritime punishment that's been around since ancient times. The actual earliest known mention of keel hauling is from the Greeks in the Rhodian Maritime Code of 700 BC, which outlines punishment for piracy. Think of it as the ultimate underwater nightmare. A sailor, often tied with a rope, is thrown overboard and dragged under the ship from one side to the other. The ship's bottom is not smooth. It's usually covered with sharp, crusty barnacles and all sorts of marine junk, and as the poor soul makes their underwater journey, these barnacles act like knives, slashing and scraping across the skin, and this punishment wasn't just about the intense pain or the very real risk of drowning, it was a stark warning to all other sailors. Step out of line and this could be you. Originally noted in ancient naval records, keel hauling was a brutal attempt to maintain discipline on ships, ensuring that everyone was quite literally kept in line, or else they'd face a fate that is straight out of a horror movie. Yeah, just so terrible.
This is another pretty self-explanatory and equally brutal punishment. Burning was a common form of punishment that was often used for anyone who was caught in the act of adultery. Now, back in ancient Egypt, adultery was seen as one of the worst crimes a person could commit. Pharaohs and authorities saw this as a direct disruption to Egyptian society that brought tremendous shame to the ancient empire. Because of the strong views and opinions the empire had on adultery, the punishments that were handed out to anyone who was found guilty of the sin were beyond brutal. One of the punishments that the ancient empire used frequently was the simple method of burning. Authorities would light the criminal's body on fire until they sustained terrible burns or simply succumbed to their injuries. This meant that it was really a toss-up if the criminal would receive capital punishment or not. If they did survive the burning, however, the criminal would be left with terrible scars that they would have to live with for the rest of their lives. After that, we have slavery. This type of punishment was extremely common for criminals who were guilty of committing petty crimes. It was extremely common in ancient Egypt, and the convicted criminals would be forced into harsh physical labor in extremely hot conditions. Many of ancient Egypt's greatest structures, including the Great Pyramids, were built by slaves who were likely serving time for past crimes. And what some people would regard as being worse than a death sentence, some criminals would also be sold into slavery for extended periods of time. Many of the slaves would often pass away from injuries sustained during work or malnourishment, so casualties were very common during the construction of large monuments. Many viewed this work as just an elongated form of capital punishment, so this was widely regarded as one of the worst punishments a person could receive in ancient Egypt. Next up is crocodile feeding. This brutal form of capital punishment was mainly reserved for repeat offenders. It was often used for anyone who had been caught stealing valuables on multiple occasions. This would be the final form of punishment that they would ever receive. First-time offenders would usually just pay a fine and return the stolen goods, but they would also need to swear by an oath that they would never steal again. This meant that anyone who broke the oath would bring a great dishonor to the empire and would literally be tossed to the crocodiles. Now, while most people would listen to the warning and would never steal again, some decided to take their chances and return to their criminal ways. Maybe they thought they were calling the pharaoh's bluff, but this just wasn't a good decision. There was absolutely no chance of defending yourself if you went against the oath, and there was no way of escaping the crocodiles. This was by far one of the most gruesome ways a person could go in ancient Egypt. After that, we have ear and nose amputations. Authorities in ancient Egypt were not afraid to take away your senses if you were a bad citizen. While we've already heard of people having their hands cut off, others would face another form of amputation punishment if they were caught in the act of adultery. While the punishment for this crime came in various forms in ancient Egypt, one of the absolute worst of them all was a person having their nose and ears cut off. It's quite clear by now that ancient Egypt had no time for anyone who committed adultery, but some of these punishments were truly on another level. This type of amputation was meant to take away a person's vital senses, but it also ensured that it would negatively affect their appearance. The authorities wanted to make sure that no one would find the criminal attractive again, so removing body parts was their way of achieving this. Of course, losing your hearing and sense of smell also made this one of the worst punishments ever. And last but not least, we have drowning. Yet another straightforward punishment that was used for some of the worst criminals in the land. This technique was used by many ancient governments as a form of capital punishment, but it was reserved for some of the most hated citizens around. Anyone who had committed a major crime or was a repeat offender could have received this terrible fate. Drowning was also a symbolic way of showing that a particular criminal had absolutely no friends in society. Authorities didn't want to waste any time or resources on them and simply wanted them out of their lives as quickly as possible. The criminal would usually be tied to a stick to ensure they couldn't escape before they were tossed into the water. Not only would the criminal's life come to an abrupt and terrible ending, but they would also have to go out knowing that absolutely nobody liked them. This should have been a fair warning to any criminal that they needed to make some very serious changes in their lives.
Next, we are talking about the wooden collar. So imagine being stuck in a giant, heavy wooden board that wraps around your neck like the world's worst fashion accessory. That that is the wooden collar for you, an ancient Chinese punishment that was both a physical and a social torment. Offenders had this massive square board with a hole just big enough for their head locked onto their necks. This clumsy collar made it impossible to eat or drink without help, turning every meal into a public spectacle of dependence and shame. People wearing the collar were often left in public places where the passerby could see their humiliation. And this also wasn't just a quick timeout. We're talking about days, weeks, or even months of lugging this lumbering frame around. It was kind of like a mobile prison that advertised your crime everywhere you went, a constant reminder to others and to yourself about the consequences of breaking the law. Imagine trying to sleep or even just rest with this bulky board. Talk about a literal nightmare. Next, we are talking about foot amputation. Imagine getting caught for a robbery and instead of jail time, they just take your foot off. That's exactly how ancient China when it came to punishing criminals. Foot amputation was a brutally effective way to handle thieves and burglars. Think about it. If you're missing a foot, sneaking around or running away after a heist isn't exactly easy. This harsh punishment served as a gruesome deterrent, sending a clear message to anyone thinking about breaking the law. Steal stuff? Lose a foot. It was about making sure that repeat offenses were next to impossible. Next, we are talking about exile. In ancient China, if you messed up big time, especially if you were a big shot, you might find yourself slapped with a one-way ticket to nowhere. Exile was a go-to punishment for high flyers who broke the rules. Instead of throwing you in a cell, they'd send you off to the most desolate, unfriendly corners of the country. Imagine being uprooted from your cozy life and dropped into a place with harsh weather, rough terrain, and none of the comforts of home. You'd have to fend for yourself in a land where the locals weren't exactly throwing welcome parties for exiled criminals. This punishment wasn't just about getting you out of sight, it was about stripping you of your status and forcing you to survive in a place where your fancy title meant zilch. Next, we are talking about flogging with a heavy whip. Kind of specific. Now, this wasn't just any old whip. We're talking about a massive, heavy-duty whip made of buffalo leather. This thing was tough, mean, and all kinds of painful. The buffalo leather made the whip thick and weighty, ensuring that each lash wasn't just a sting, but a deep bruising impact that could break skin and leave serious marks. You'd be brought out in front of a crowd because, let's face it, punishments back then were also about sending a message to everyone else. Don't do what this guy did. You'd be tied up, often to a post or sometimes just forced to lay down, making sure you couldn't wiggle your way out of what was coming. The executioner, a guy who is usually pretty burly because swinging that heavy whip was no easy task, would then start the flogging. Based on what you did, the number of lashes would be decided. Stole something minor, maybe like 10 lashes. Something more severe, we could be talking 50, 100, or even more lashes. Each lash from the heavy whip wasn't just a simple hit. The thick buffalo leather could cause gashes, tear into muscle, and even break bones if the hit was in the right spot. If the crime was really serious, the number of lashes could be high enough that the person wouldn't survive. The absolute horror, a punishment that starts out as painful and ends up as lethal. Next, we are talking about the facial tattooing. This was like the ultimate walk of shame. It wasn't like your cool hipster tattoo. This was a big, bold label like thief or traitor inked right onto your forehead, your cheek, sometimes even just the whole thing. First off, this wasn't just a quick in and out at the tattoo parlor, you know, a little walk-in. The process was painful. They used natural dyes, maybe soot or ink, and a needle to etch the words into your skin. There were no numbing creams, of course, so you felt every poke and prod of that needle. The idea was all about shame and prevention. In a time where your reputation was everything, having thief tattooed on your face was a serious blow. It wasn't just a punishment for the crime you committed, it was a lifelong reminder to you and everyone else that you crossed the line. Plus, again, like a lot of these, it was a major deterrent. If you saw someone with thief tattooed on their face, would you hire them? Trust them? Probably not. So this was a way to keep people in line by fear of public humiliation. Having such a tattoo made life incredibly hard. It wasn't like you could just move to another city and start fresh. Your face preceded you everywhere you went. Finding a job, making friends, or even just buying groceries without being judged or shunned was nearly impossible. And finally on this list today we are talking about hair cutting. Now let me tell you about one of ancient China's more unusual punishments that didn't involve physical torment but was still pretty harsh. Cutting someone's hair. Now, before you shrug it off as a minor penalty, let me set the scene to explain why this was such a big deal back then. In ancient China, your hair was more than just a personal style statement. It was a symbol of your dignity and respect for your ancestors. Confucian teachings emphasized the importance of preserving your body as it was given by your parents, which included your hair. So cutting someone's hair wasn't just a makeover, it was a major sign of disgrace. If someone committed a crime, especially a minor one, the authorities might chop off their hair instead of throwing them in jail or giving them the bamboo treatment. This hair cutting was like a walking billboard saying, "Hey, look at me, I did something wrong." In a culture that valued honor and appearance, this was absolutely brutal. Also, we have to remember, family was everything. If you came home with your hair cut off, you weren't just in trouble, you actually disgraced your entire family. Dinner time would definitely get pretty awkward, and family gatherings? Forget about it. You'd be the talk of the town, and not in a good way. It's definitely a hair-raising tale that shows sometimes the simplest penalties can carry the heaviest weights in the right context. Beheading was pretty much the go-to method for executing nobles and royals in ancient India, sort of like the VIP treatment in the grim world of capital punishment, seen as a somewhat honorable way to go, especially compared to some of the more brutal methods like being trampled by elephants or impaled. Beheading was quick and believed to be less painful. Historical texts sometimes recount the use of beheading for high-profile traitors or warriors who had fallen from grace. For instance, in some ancient tales, heroic figures captured in battle would be granted this less dishonorable death. It was not only about ending lives, but also about preserving some semblance of dignity in death, ensuring the elite met their end with a swift strike rather than prolonged suffering. In ancient India, branding wasn't just about marking livestock, it was also a stark punishment for criminals, leaving a permanent scar that spoke louder than words. Imagine having a hot iron pressed against your skin, not just searing the flesh, but also stamping a symbol of your crime for everyone to see. For instance, a thief might be branded with the image of a dog, a symbol that marked them as untrustworthy and sneaky. According to the Manu Smriti, a revered Hindu law book, branding was prescribed for various misdeeds, including theft and giving false testimony. This kind of punishment served multiple purposes. It was a painful penalty, a lifelong mark of shame, and a public declaration of one's misdeeds, all rolled into one fiery imprint. It was the ancient world's version of a criminal record that could never leave you behind. In ancient India, tossing someone off of a cliff wasn't just a dramatic way to say goodbye, it was a literal execution method for the worst offenders. Known as throwing from heights, this punishment involved hurling criminals from cliffs or the top of tall structures, and it was just as much about the spectacle as it was about the sentence. The gravity of the crime was matched by the gravity that they faced, quite literally. This method was symbolic too. It represented a cleansing of sorts, removing the unwanted elements from society by physically casting them out. While there aren't many specific historical figures tied to this fate, the method itself underscores the ancient judicial system's blend of harshness and theatrics. Banishment really packed a punch back in the day. Imagine being totally cut off from your family, your friends, and all of the familiar nooks of your neighborhood. That's kind of what banishment was about. It wasn't just a timeout, it was like being told you couldn't play in your own backyard ever again. And then there's exile, which was even more intense, especially if you dabbled in politics a bit too much. You'd have to pack up and leave the kingdom entirely. Think of Rama from the Hindu epic the Ramayana. This guy got hit with a 14-year exile from his own kingdom. That's a long time to be away from home, roaming forests and dealing with all sort of epic challenges. The method of boiling as an execution tool might sound like something straight out of a horror tale, but in ancient India it was a grim reality for those who committed particularly vile acts. A giant cauldron bubbling away with either oil or water at a scalding temperature, the condemned would then be unceremoniously tossed in, facing a gruesome and agonizing end. This extreme punishment was not doled out lightly, it was reserved for the worst of the worst crimes. Crimes so heinous that mere death wasn't punishment enough. Its inclusion in ancient legal codes suggests that it was a vivid, terrifying deterrent used to instill fear and ensure societal norms were not just followed, but revered. So, while the pot for boiling might have been less common compared to other methods, its very existence underlies the harsh justice system of ancient times, where the severity of the punishment matched the perceived immorality of the crime. That'd be so up. Imagine just watching someone boil. I don't know, that's just crazy. And people back in the day really just like gathered. They were like, oh yeah, Timothy's getting executed today, we all gotta go downtown. It's just so crazy. Alright. In ancient India, being sentenced to death by burning was another one of those punishments reserved for the most heinous of crimes. A fiery fate that was as dramatic as it is terrifying. Picture a public gathering, the air thick with anticipation and a little bit of fear, as the condemned is either tied to a stake or hurled into a gaping fire pit. It was a vivid public spectacle meant to sear the consequences of grave sins into the collective memory of the onlookers. Historical texts don't shy away from these grim tales, like the infamous instance of a queen accused of witchcraft, doomed to prove her innocence or perish in the flames. Starting off today, we are talking about crucifixion, which really tops the charts for being one of the most notoriously brutal punishments in ancient Rome. You were tied or nailed, yes, actual nails, through the wrists and feet to a massive wooden cross. This isn't just a quick and merciful end, it is a long, drawn-out ordeal where you're left hanging. The cause of death? Typically exhaustion or asphyxiation as the body slumps and breathing becomes increasingly difficult. Reserved primarily for the worst offenders in society's eyes, like rebels, pirates, and unfortunate slaves, it was a grim fate meant to serve as a warning to others. Imagine walking down the road and seeing this macabre spectacle. It was truly an everyday reality in Roman times, meant to instill fear and obedience in the populace. Next up, we are talking about damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This was one of ancient Rome's more horrifying spectacles, tailor-made for the adrenaline-pumped crowds of the Colosseum. Imagine being sentenced to a gruesome end where you're tossed into a giant arena, your heart pounding as the gates creak open to unleash a fury of wild animals. Lions, bears, maybe even a leopard or two would emerge, their eyes locked on their next meal. For the audience, it was a thrilling and chilling show, a live horror drama played out under the Roman sun. The condemned, often criminals or prisoners of war, had little chance of survival and were used as human playthings to demonstrate the power of Rome and entertain the masses through sheer brutality. It was merciless and morbidly captivating, a reminder of the deadly stakes of falling out of favor in the ancient empire. Next on our list today is decimation. This is one of those brutally straightforward Roman military practices that sounds almost too harsh to be true. Imagine a whole unit in the Roman army messes up. Maybe they fled from battle or failed a crucial task. So instead of the typical scolding or a slap on the wrist, their punishment cranks up to a grim extreme. The commanders would line them up and randomly pick one out of every 10 soldiers. Now, here's the real kicker. These unlucky guys were then executed by their own comrades, often with clubs or stones. Why such a severe punishment? Well, of course, it was all about fear and control. By making an example of a few, the Romans kept the entire unit in line, ensuring that everyone else fought harder and followed orders to a T in the future. This method just goes to show that in Roman times, discipline in in the army was literally a matter of life and death. Next, we are talking about pena culae, or punishment of the sack. This was ancient Rome's horrific answer to the unthinkable crime of parricide, which is killing your own parent or close relative. Imagine being sewn up in a heavy leather sack, not alone, but with a motley crew of agitated animals. A snapping dog, a hissing snake, a screeching monkey, and a flustered rooster. Once everything was all stitched up, the sack and its living contents would be tossed into a river or the sea. The mix of animals wasn't just random, each represented different symbolic aspects of the crime. This very bizarre and brutal punishment combined physical suffering with psychological terror, ensuring that the condemned faced a panicky, frenzied end. It's a wildly over-the-top penalty that underscores just how seriously the Romans took the crime of destroying one's own family. Next on our list today, we are talking about fustuarium, which is another brutal military punishment. This was the Roman military's no-nonsense way of dealing with soldiers who stepped out of line by showing cowardice or by deserting their posts. Think of it as the ultimate tough love. If you messed up, your own buddies were the ones who had to beat you to death with rods or cudgels. It wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoer, it was to show everyone else in the ranks about the serious consequences of breaking the rules. This brutal method was both a punishment and a deterrent, ensuring that soldiers remained committed in battle and loyal to their unit. It seemed like if you messed up in the Roman military, you could expect the punishment to come from those you likely just fought alongside. It's pretty dark for everyone involved, I'm not gonna lie.
Modern day punishments for wrongdoing are a cakewalk compared to how Romans treated those accused of ickiness. From being fed to wild animals to being castrated or worse, we've got a lot of bad stuff to cover today, so let's get into it. For starters, if you're looking for cruel and unusual forms of torment, you don't have to look any further than ancient Rome. Take for instance a punishment that was described by both Apuleius, the golden rear end, and Lucian, or Lucius, or the rear end. So we've got a donkey. They're going to be killed, their belly's going to be sliced open, and you're going to take out all the entrails and everything. So your accused person is going to be stripped of their clothing and stuffed into the animal's belly. The belly is going to be stitched back up, leaving only the accused's head outside, preventing, loss of air but prolonging suffering. The donkey's body is going to be kept in the sun and it's going to decompose, with the living victim inside being cooked by the heat. And then you gotta deal with the maggots that are crawling all over the accused, and vultures picking at the animal's decaying flesh and eyes. Death, well welcomed, came slowly for victims of this specific type of hell. St. Gregory described a heinous form of torment that was performed on young women by the people of Heliopolis under Roman rule. So any virgin who was to undergo this form of torment was first handed over to gladiators to make sure she wasn't still intact. After they made sure that that was not the case, she would be publicly stripped and her belly would be diced open, taking out all of her innards. And then you'd stuff in handfuls of barley and sew her back up, and then give that to wild hogs. Then, well, they'd eat what they want, and hopefully she would die quickly. In ancient Rome, the higher your status, the more people you were allowed to bone without consequence. For example, the emperor could get it on with pretty much anybody that he wanted. A general could make a move on a lieutenant or a common citizen, and soldiers could go after common citizens. Climbing up the ladder, though? Forbidden. So if a common citizen decided to penetrate an unwilling soldier, game over. I'm talking public castration. If the soldier willingly allowed the common citizen to penetrate him, then he's going to be disemboweled. These rules, coupled with true love between men, really muddied up the waters. It was easy for anybody to accuse a man of breaking rank or willingly giving into penetration by a man of lesser status. In Rome, yes, castration was kind of rare, but it was recorded. It was mostly prevalent during the late Roman Empire, so around 300 AD, and also it was kind of normal for the royal court. The goal was to keep the emperor's wife free of suspected trysts with the not-so-hired help. Remember, Caesar's wife not only had to be pure, she had to appear to be so as well. Now there was legislation that tried to prevent castration, but eunuchs in the Roman Empire were increasingly popular and powerful. They came to be associated with the imperial bedchamber and privy to the innermost workings of the empire. So sometimes castration was punishment, sometimes people wanted it. So when I say you're being sacked, nobody think you lose your job, right? Well, this is a little different. So the Romans ushered in the use of poena culae, meaning the penalty of the sack. This is where a criminal is sewn up in a basic leather sack and tossed in the water, with death being the ultimate goal. The general consensus is poena coli first appeared in Titus Livy's History of Rome. In it, it's described how somebody was sewn into a sack and thrown out to sea in 101 BC for killing their mother. Livy's versions of events appear tame compared to later versions of this punishment, which also included the use of live animals. Now, I mentioned that earlier, but I felt like this deserved two separate spots on today's lists. According to Emperor Justinian's laws from AD 530, this is not end of life by the sword or by fire, or any form of punishment, but the criminal is sewn up in a sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape, and in this dismal prison is thrown into the sea or a river. Luckily, the ancient Romans reserved this rarely given punishment for parricide. So if you knocked off a parent or another close relative, darn, I was gonna kill my mom. Oh shit, I probably can't say that. Out of all the ways to die, being drawn and quartered was probably the worst. The people who deserved such an end were not meant to be seen as human, and the pain, humiliation, and brutality was intended to create a distinct separation between the audience and the condemned. The message was that normal men would not suffer the multiple deaths. So, how would one explain what quartering is without getting into incredible amounts of internet trouble? Hold on to your heads, folks. Remember biology class in high school? Having to dissect a frog or a starfish or whatever? Okay, so picture doing that to an alive or just freshly dead human. And yeah, it's gonna be just as messy and clumsy as you would have done when you did it to the starfish. Ooh, that smell. Finally, you're gonna quarter the unfortunate victim. So sometimes this was achieved by tying each limb to a different horse, which were then startled into running in different directions so as to rip the body apart. Hey, nobody cared about horse welfare back then. It showed.
From being dropped on pointy objects and being tossed into a river while tied to a chair, these are some of the worst forms of punishment that have ever existed. First on our list is elephant trampling. Yeah, there's absolutely no way to make this sound any less gruesome than it actually is. Many countries who had access to elephants employed them as executioners who would punish some of the worst criminals in the land. There were all sorts of punishments a serious criminal could face hundreds of years ago, but being stepped on by a 10,000-pound foot is by far one of the worst. Authorities would tie the person down to the ground and use bait to lure the elephant over to the prisoner. The elephant would then walk over them and simply crush them with all of its might. To make matters even worse, this execution would sometimes be performed in a stadium full of people. Not only would the criminal experience excruciating pain in their final moments, they would also be left with the humiliation of knowing that everybody was watching. The elephant didn't know any better, but it was actually one of the scariest creatures on Earth hundreds of years ago. After that, we have the head crusher. This one is pretty self-explanatory and is just as bad as it sounds. Criminals who committed some of the worst crimes imaginable would often receive a punishment that was fit for the sin they had committed. This was essentially a vice that would slowly tighten on a person's head as it was being pulled by an executioner. This was a very slow and painful way to go, and it's quite clear to see why this was considered one of the worst punishments of all time. However, it wasn't always used as a form of capital punishment. Some authorities would simply use it as a torture device, while others would use it as an interrogation tactic. If the authorities had captured a guilty criminal and wanted them to confess to their crimes, they would use the head crusher to get the answers they wanted. The device would tighten until the person couldn't take any more and shout out the information the authorities wanted to hear. Up next, we have impalements. Another one that really needs no introduction, but is absolutely horrible. There are many ways that different civilizations went through with this form of punishment, but all of them had the exact same result. Anyone who committed a serious offense or was a repeat offender could face the possibility of being impaled. Sometimes they would just be tied to a wall and executioner did the impaling themselves, but other cases called for the person to be dropped on a large spike. The infamous Vlad the Impaler was quite fond of this gruesome punishment and used it on pretty much anyone who crossed him. It is rumored that there were forests full of stakes that had the bodies of his enemies stuck on the ends of them. Perhaps Vlad decided to keep them around as a trophy of some sort, but there's no way anyone else actually enjoyed seeing such a gruesome display. Next up, we have hand amputations. Ancient civilizations really didn't think too highly of burglars. Now, this has been a serious problem in every time period, but there were far more gruesome ways of dealing with these pesky thieves many years ago. While first-time offenders would usually have to pay a fine or spend a few nights in jail, repeat offenders who continued to cross the line would end up with a much worse fate. If someone was caught stealing on multiple occasions and never learned their lesson, the authorities could choose to cut their hands off and literally rob them of their ability to steal. This was a pretty horrific punishment, but it's quite clear the ruling authorities wanted to send a message. This more than likely would have stopped most thieves from committing the same crimes over and over again, but some people just didn't get the initial warning. Hand amputations were a never-ending torture that lasted for the rest of the criminal's life. Next on our list is the Cat of Nine Tails. No, this is not a Pokemon or any type of stuffed animal. The Cat of Nine Tails was a simple but deadly tool that was very popular amongst pirates. It was basically a whip with 9 strands knotted at the ends, and the only purpose it served was to deliver crushing blows to anyone who misbehaved. The usual number of lashings a person would receive was 39, because according to pirate code, that was the most any man could handle before they passed away. But even if someone managed to make it through that nasty beating, they could end up receiving some nasty infections from the whip. The cat would never be clean following past beatings, and this meant that every prisoner was being smacked around with somebody else's remains. The whip would usually develop all sorts of mold, this would obviously transfer over to whoever was being hit with it. The expression letting the cat out of the bag also stemmed from this gruesome form of punishment that no pirate ever wanted to see.
Number 5. Hera and Heracles. Bless my soul, Herc was on a roll, and Hera, the queen of gods, was extremely jealous of that. All those other women in her husband's life. Zeus's consorts, and Hera hated the kids that came along with the adultery. One of them being, of course, Heracles, who puts the glad in gladiator, Hercules. Yeah, that's the same dude. I was a 90s kid. As the story goes, Hera caused Hercules so much trouble that he was actually driven mad on one occasion. According to Homer, just before Hercules was born, Zeus announced a prophecy that would make Hercules the ruler of the heavens in his place when the time came. Hera didn't like that so much. She kind of pushed the birth thing a little bit. Hera also made Herc crazy. Little bit of roid rage, you know? In a blind rage one night, he kills his wife and son under the rage spell of Hera. Part of this punishment was that the insanity was just temporary, so when he came to and realized that he John Wicked everyone, yeah, she had won. In sadness, he smashed about 12 labors and got himself back on track. Talk about zero to hero. Number 4. Arachne and Athena. Okay, so little hex here, little labors there. The wrath of the gods is pretty tame so far. Well, was. And then there's the story of Arachne. Ovid recounts the very talented mortal Arachne, daughter of Idmon, challenged Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, to a weaving contest. Yeah, you don't challenge the goats to what make them great, you know? When Athena could find no flaws or errors in the tapestry, she was pretty pissed. When Athena saw that Arachne had not only insulted the gods in what she had drawn, but done so with a work far more beautiful than Athena's own art, she was enraged. She ripped Arachne's work to shreds, and terrified of what comes next, Arachne took her own life. Athena brought her back to life, cursing her after a little sprinkle of Hecate's herb, an ancient poison. Arachne's hair started falling out, and then her nose fell off, and then her fingers, as her whole body started slowly turning into a giant spider. And this is apparently now why we have spiders. Yeah, thanks to this epic weave-off. Number 3. Hera and Lamia. Lamia was a beautiful Libyan queen, and enter Zeus stage right. Of course, loved by Zeus. Yeah, basically through no fault of her own, she got the wrath of Hera upon herself. This dude's commitment skills leads these people to get in a line of fire with some nasty curses. Hera cursed this lady hard. Every time she gave birth to a child, Hera either murdered it or made her eat it, regardless if it was Zeus's or not. Hera was like, nah, never again, now eat it.
All of them.
Even babies that weren't hers. Basically every night Lamia would ravenously make her way village to village eating mothers' babies. That's horrible. She swore to bereave all mothers of their children just as she had been once by Hera. Trying to help, of course, Zeus gave her removable eyes so that she was blind but harmless in the day, but after she popped those bad boys in, feeding time. Hera's mean, man. Number 2. Poseidon and Pasiphae. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more into like disturbing graphic land with some of the more cruel things here. What started out as a rumor that some people were kind of smelly is turning into like eternities of pain and suffering and stuff. Pasiphae was a queen of Crete and often regarded as the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. The daughter of Helios and the ocean nymph Perse, Pasiphae is notable as the mother of the Minotaur. You'll see why. She conceived the Minotaur after mating with the Cretan bull. Minos was required to sacrifice the fairest bull to Poseidon each year. One year, Minos, king, refused to sacrifice his most beautiful strong bull and sacrificed an inferior weak bull instead. Dude, don't with the gods. As punishment, of course, Poseidon then cursed his wife Pasiphae to fall head over heels obsession lust for this beautiful giant prized bull. And
many months later,
Pasiphae gave birth to a half-human, half-bull creature famously known as the Minotaur. The curse was sent out as a reminder to her husband Minos quality over quantity kind of deal. That's heartbreaking. For her, of course. Her husband's cheap, so she has to birth a bull. It's not really fair, I'd say. And coming in at number 1, Prometheus and Zeus. And our number 1 spot, of course, must go to the god of gods himself. He can be pretty shady. Cheating on all his lovers, fighting with his old man and his kids. He's a little unpredictable at times. This one, ramping up the cruelty, we have Prometheus. He was our guy. This demigod loved us and stole fire for us. He fought on our behalf. He led the Titans into a trap, securing power amongst the gods again. He was everybody's friend, besides Zeus. Yeah, Zeus didn't like the tricks and the new plans and all the attention he was getting. So Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining the Titan god to a rock with the might of Zeus himself. And then, worst part of course, having an eagle day in and day out just eat his insides out. Basically just slowly eating him for eternity. He would heal overnight, but then come the AM, breakfast again for eternity. Okay, so a little humanity never hurt anybody except for poor Prometheus. Thank you for the wonderful campfires. We now have s'mores, they taste great. But Hercules is coming, buddy. He's gonna come save you. I've seen the last chapter, no spoilers alert. Well, there you have it, folks. 10 times the ancient gods got a little pissed and decided to dish out some justice themselves. I mean, I don't agree with like almost all of these. Turning a woman into a spider because she's a better weaver? Like, just admit defeat. Or like Robin Hooding for the good of people, only to be eaten alive every day by a giant bird? I don't know. Eye for an eye, you know?
Number 10, Judas Cradle. Right off the hop, we'll start with a bad one. I mean, they're all pretty bad, but this one is so specific, you know what I mean? This is a brutal torture device used in the medieval ages to punish those who were accused of adultery or blasphemy. Yeah, adultery. This is what would happen to you. Imagine this. The victim would be placed on top of a pyramid shaped seat, not really a seat at all, just a sharp pyramid, and they'd be slowly lowered onto it by ropes. Now the pointed tip of said seat/pyramid would penetrate their anything in this region at all bad, all rough time. And this of course would often lead to death due to infection. The Judas Cradle was painful, it was intimate, and it was slow. It was horrible. It was considered an effective way of obtaining confessions from suspects. Even if they were innocent, they're like, sure, I did it. Get me off of this thing. What the fuck? This painful and gruesome method of punishment is thankfully no longer in use today, obviously, but occasionally I'm gonna pop up and remind you not to forget about it. It's horrible. The Justice Department has things to fix today, sure, I'll say that, but at least we're not lowering the accused onto the chair of death. Let's leave that one in the past. Number 9, the choke pear. Great name, already looking forward to this one. Also known as the Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish was a medieval punishment device used to humiliate its victims, really. The device was inserted into the victim's mouth, or again, other places, and then slowly expanded open using a screw mechanism until it reached its full size. Yeah, almost like something from Saw, just like that, exactly. This caused immense pain and often resulted in permanent injury, or, of course, as you can imagine, death. The choke pear was also used to extract confessions from suspects or prisoners. Despite its gruesome nature, the choke pear actually remained in use for centuries and was only officially banned in the 19th century. Yeah, you're like, what is this, ancient Egypt, Rome, Greek, what is this? No, it's like 200 years ago. Today, examples of the device can be found in museums, so if you see something that looks kind of like a choke pear, they're all fancy for some reason. Take a minute and reflect on these horrors. They used to punish men for homosexuality with a choke pear. Humans are disgusting. Number 8, scaphism. First used in ancient Persia. The victim here would be stripped naked and placed inside of 2 hollowed out tree trunks, or sometimes boats. But only their heads, hands, and feet were exposed. You were literally stuck in a tree. Now, if that's not already uncomfortable and haunting in the hot sun already, they would then be force-fed honey and milk until they were extremely ill. And of course, all of that happening in tight quarters inside of a tree trunk. Well, as time passed, maggots would eat away at the victim's flesh, causing infections and gangrene. And also, it's horrible. It's so uncomfortable. The process could take days or even weeks to kill the victim. This method of punishment was meant to be slow and painful. And of course, the typical ancient fashion, it was very public. Everyone came out to watch, serving as a warning to others who may have committed similar crimes that somehow deserve being stuck in a tree. No way. Number 7, the punishment of non-existence. Ooh, this one's pretty good. It's different, but it's definitely worth a mention on our list today. When we talk about pharaohs or pretty much anything from ancient history, we know nothing. I mean, really, so many books destroyed, that much time passed. There's countless leaders that we know nothing of, and it has a little something to do with damnatio memoriae. Damnatio memoriae was a practice in ancient Rome that involved erasing the memory of an individual or group from history. Just ever gone. Control Alt Delete. See you later, Brad. This was done by destroying any and all physical evidence of their existence, such as statues or inscriptions, and banning the use of their name. That's incredible. It was typically used to punish individuals who had committed treason or other crimes against the state, but it could also be applied to those who were, well, simply unpopular with the ruling class. Yeah, getting canceled, but in ancient Rome. There we go. Some guy's scratching your face out of a rock. He's like, nah, you don't exist anymore, buddy. How's that sound? That's horrible. That is so, cutting to 2023 now, yeah, they're gone. We have no idea who they are. The effectiveness of this varied depending on the circumstances. In some cases, it succeeded in erasing the memory or the group completely, while in others, it only generated more interest in them. Know what I mean? You cancel somebody now today and you're like, well, who are these people? What did they do? Today we do this, but it's just, blocking somebody on socials. Mute. See ya. Number 6, Iron Maiden. Great, now Run to the Hills. It's gonna be stuck in my head all day. Not bad, honestly not bad. Hit the thumbs up for the Iron Maiden band. Not for this content, just for the band. Iron Maidens were tricky. An Iron Maiden was a device used in the Middle Ages, and it was an upright coffin-shaped humanoid-looking box with spikes on the inside that would puncture the victim when they were placed inside and had that big scary door closed. The spikes were long enough to cause significant pain and injury, but not long enough to kill the victim immediately. Ergo, horribleness. The victim would be left inside for hours or even days, slowly succumbing to their injuries and eventually dying from infection or, well, just blood loss. This method of punishment was considered cruel due to its prolonged nature and the physical torment that it inflicted on the victim. Because yeah, even without the spikes inside, this one would drive me nuts. Oh, terrifying. It's like the movie Buried, but somehow worse.
Oh, moving on to something that is not at all better. We're talking about the brazen bull. Imagine a punishment so diabolical that it sounds like something cooked up in a horror movie director's wildest dreams. Welcome to ancient Sicily's creation, the brazen bull. This wasn't just any statue, it was a hollow brass bull, life-sized and terrifyingly real. Condemned criminals would be locked inside of this metallic beast and a fire would be lit underneath. As the metal heated up, the poor soul inside would suffer a very gruesome fate, essentially being roasted alive. To add a layer of grim theatrics, as if this all wasn't enough, the bull was designed with a series of tubes and stops that transformed the screams of the condemned into sounds resembling the bellowing of an angry bull. Okay, that is just messed up. It's said that the inventor, Perillus of Athens, wanted to please Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, with this horrific spectacle. Ironically, legends say that Phalaris was so disgusted or perhaps intrigued by the hideousness of the device that he decided to test it on Perillus himself. Talk about a creator falling victim to his creation. This method of execution is a chilling reminder of the lengths to which human cruelty can go. Like the sound, they really just didn't have to go that far. It just seems like really we just pushed it as a little one step over the line. Okay, maybe 45 steps. Next, we are talking about the Wheel of Torment. This was a frightfully effective method used in ancient Greece to deal with the worst of offenders. A massive wooden wheel, the kind you'd rather see on a peaceful watermill and not in this context. The unfortunate soul condemned to this device would be tied spread eagle across it. Then the grim process began. They'd be spun around while being beaten or stretched, and it was a ghastly sight and was designed to inflict maximum pain. This brutal technique wasn't just for punishment, it also served a more sinister purpose, extracting confessions from those who were still holding back secrets. The idea was that under extreme agony, people would spill anything to make it stop. As a part of the execution process, it prolonged the suffering to an excruciating extent, ensuring that the final moments of the condemned were anything but quick or merciful. Definitely a form of ancient justice that would make anyone cringe. Next, we are talking about stoning. In ancient Greece, this was the ultimate community event, but definitely not the kind you'd probably ever want to participate in. Reserved for some of the most heinous offenses like killing or treason, this punishment was as brutal as it was public. Everyone in the community could get involved, hurling stones at the condemned individual until they were were literally buried under the weight of their alleged crimes. It wasn't just about doling out death, it was a clear, hard message of where the society stood on certain actions. This extreme form of societal condemnation was meant to deter others by making an example out of the offender. Next, we are talking about exposure. In ancient Sparta, the commitment to a formidable and efficient military was taken extremely seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they practiced exposure, a chilling method of weeding out those they deemed unfit for future service. If an individual was judged to lack the physical capabilities required by Spartan society, they might be left alone in the wilderness, a harsh sentence carried out to maintain the robust and unyielding nature of their forces. This practice underscored the Spartan belief that the strength of the city-state depended on the vigor and health of its people, pushing to the extreme their values of resilience and endurance. While this concept might sound shockingly cruel today, it was a stark reflection of the brutal realities and societal norms that underpinned one of history's most famously militaristic cultures. Next up today, we are talking about public humiliation. Public humiliation was the ancient Greek version of making sure everyone knew you messed up big time. If you committed a minor offense like pilfering some olives from the market or slacking on your civic duties, you might find yourself slapped into the stocks in the middle of town. This wasn't just about keeping you still for a bit, it was about letting every passerby have their say, whether that was a stern look, a disapproving tut, or a few choice words about your character. It was the ancient equivalent of being called out on social media, except instead of emojis, you got real tomatoes to the face. This form of punishment was really about keeping the social order intact. By making an example of someone, the community hoped to instill a bit of fear and a lot of shame, enough to deter anyone else from breaking the rules. It was a tough love kind of law enforcement that made sure everyone stayed in line, or at least got a good laugh at the expense of those who didn't. And finally on our list today, we are talking about debt slavery. Imagine living in ancient Greece where falling into debt could land you a whole new job, unfortunately as a slave. If you borrowed money and couldn't pay it back, the penalty wasn't just a bunch of angry letters from the bank. Instead, you could find yourself in debt slavery, which was as tough as it sounds. You'd be working off what you owed, but the twist was that your salary was now just the opportunity to slowly chip away at your debt. And here's where things get even crazier. This financial faux pas could drag your whole family down with you, turning a private money mishap into a family-wide crisis. Households could end up stuck in a loop of servitude, working indefinitely to regain their freedom. This harsh practice highlights just how seriously the Greeks took financial obligations, mixing economics with a heavy dose of legal consequences.